Good evening. So the last few weeks we've been studying the city of Jerusalem. And you'll notice that all the times that we have looked at Jerusalem, we've been looking at books of the Bible. We started in 2 Samuel with David as he conquered the Jebusites and made Jerusalem his capital city. And then in 2 Kings and 2 Chronicles, we saw, go back a little bit further into 2 Kings, 1 Kings, 2 Kings, we saw Solomon's temple and how Jerusalem expanded. And now we're looking at a period of time. Well, let me just continue to fill in. We then saw the fall of Jerusalem in 2 Kings and 2 Chronicles, how it fell to the Chaldeans and to Nebuchadnezzar, the king of the Chaldeans. And then we noted the period of the exile and the return, and we looked at that last week, and we looked at that in the books of 2 Chronicles, Ezra, and Haggai. And now tonight, what we're going to study is going to be a period of history that is not covered in the Scriptures. It's going to be the period, in Dan's prayer he covered it exactly right. It's called the intertestamental period, but it's the period from Malachi to the birth of Jesus. About 400 years. And just because there's no biblical revelation during that time doesn't mean that God is not at work. And so I want to ask you, if you will, to turn in your Bibles to Luke chapter 2. I want us to read chapter 2, verses 1 through 7. So, it came about in those days that a decree went out from Caesar Augustus that a census be taken of all the inhabited earth. This was the first census taken while Quirinius was governor of Syria. And all were proceeding to register for the census, everyone to his own city. And Joseph also went up from Galilee, from the city of Nazareth to Judea, to the city of David, which is called Bethlehem, because he was of the house and family of David, in order to register along with Mary, who was engaged to him and was with child. And it came about that while they were there, the days were completed for her to give birth. And she gave birth to her first son, and she wrapped him in clothes and laid him in a manger, because there was no room for them in the inn. And so what you see here is the birth of Jesus, and you'll notice that a Roman governor, Quirinius, has made an edict that all of Israel is to go for a census so that they can be taxed by the Roman government. Well, when we left Malachi, we left the book of Haggai, there was no mention of Romans. In fact, Israel was a province that was ruled by Persia, but they had relative freedom as long as they paid their tribute to the Persian government. But a lot has happened since then. And we could go back to the book of Matthew also in chapter 2, and we would find a man by the name of Herod. And we would see that Herod is very interested in the birth of Jesus, wouldn't we? And in the birth of Jesus, Herod actually wants to assassinate Jesus, and so he employs these men from the east who have come to see the star, and I believe that they were familiar with the Old Testament, because we talked about this. One of the important things that has happened because of the Jews being conquered is the diaspora. The Jews have been scattered all over the nations. And so they have an influence everywhere, and so their culture and their writings are known in other nations. So now we see Herod, we see the Romans. They weren't there in the time of Persia, so we left off really with the book of Haggai in about 516 BC. Now, what has happened between 516 and the birth of Jesus? We're going to cover a great deal of that tonight. And I have a chart here for you, and hopefully for those of you who will be watching this later on, we'll provide this information online as well as an addendum to the lesson, because I think it's very helpful. So let's just go quickly through the chart. In 586 BC, Nebuchadnezzar takes Jerusalem for the third time, and he takes King Zedekiah. And as you know, we saw in the scripture how that he killed his children before his eyes and then put his eyes out. And then about 539, the Babylonians lose power to the Persians. And Cyrus the Great of Persia allows the Judeans, all Jews who want to return to Jerusalem. Now, not all went back, but many did. And these were the upper crust of what had been in Jerusalem before the fall of Jerusalem in 586 BC. In 516, where we left off, the second temple is completed. It replaces the first temple that was built by Solomon, which was destroyed by Nebuchadnezzar. We know that the second temple was in no way comparable to the first temple in its size and its grandeur and all of that. We saw this in Ezra, where at the ceremony when they dedicated the temple, the second temple, many of the old people were weeping because they remembered how grand the first temple was. Others were shouting, and the sound went up mingled, so you really couldn't tell if they were shouting or if they were weeping. So this is the condition in 516. For the next 100 years plus, the Persians rule, and there is peace in Judea. It's not a lot of prosperity, it's some prosperity. However, things are going to change, and it's going to stir things up when a man by the name of Alexander, who we know in history as Alexander the Great, comes to power. He's 20 years old when he begins to conquer the world. He's going to go 14,000 miles. If you can imagine, when people traveled by horse, 14,000 miles from Macedonia in Greece to Egypt, across the Persian Empire, into India, where we would fight people on elephants. For 13 years, or 12 to 13 years, he was on this road to conquest. During this time, he went through Palestine, which would be Judea. Remember, we said last week that the province of Judea was called Yehu, which is where the word Jews comes from. Interesting fact from history. He conquers this part of the world along with along with Egypt. And after his conquest to what river was it in India? And feel free to talk. If you ask a question, I'll just repeat the question for those who are watching. So you can do just like you do any Wednesday night. Just ask the question if you'd like. So it's not the Hindus, but anyway, he goes as far as mid-India, and on the way back, at the age of, I think, 32, he dies from a fever. 4 of his generals will take over. We'll see that in just a few moments. From Syria to Egypt, the kingdom is divided between those who are from Seleucus, who are called the Seleucids, and Ptolemy, the Ptolemies. Ptolemy to the south, the Seleucids to the north, primarily in the Syrian area, and they're going to challenge each other for this piece of land called Judea. And it's going to be back and forth for a long time. This is going to have a really great impact upon the time Jesus is born. About 175 BC, Antiochus III begins dabbling in the affairs of the Judean high priest in Jerusalem. So what happens now is that the Seleucids, contrary to what the Persians did and contrary to what the Greeks had done to this point, began to meddle in the affairs of other countries' religions. And the reason they did this was because these generals believed that Alexander wanted not only to conquer the world, he wanted to Hellenize the world. He wanted to bring Greek culture to the world because he thought the Greek culture was superior. He was a student of Aristotle. For that reason, he you think about Alexandria, Egypt, and the great library there and all the rest. He was very big, not just on conquest, but on leaving behind Greek culture. And some of these generals and their heirs were trying to do the same thing. And what happens in Jerusalem, and you see this in the New Testament, you have the Hellenistic Jews and the traditional Jews. And even when they come to the church, when God saves them, we see conflict sometimes, for example, in Acts 6, between the Hellenistic Jews and the traditional Jews. Why is one of the reasons they call them Hellenists is not because they're from other parts of the world, some of them were, but it was because they adapted Hellenistic ways. The gym, the public baths, and many of these things will come to pass in Jerusalem in time, but to begin with, they resist that. And in 167 BC, they're going through the countryside. They have their generals and their captains, and they're going through the countryside, and they're trying to arrest people and stop people from making the sacrifices to God. And Malachi is involved in this, and he kills, and again, we'll see this in the lesson in just a few moments. This is just previewing. He kills one of the officers, and the Maccabean rebellion began. Goes on for 25 years, and finally Simon Maccabee will destroy the Seleucid fortress in Jerusalem, which is called the Acra, and establish for the first time the Jewish kingdom, which is ruled by what is known as the Hasmonean dynasty. And that word Hasmonean comes from Hasidim, which means the pure ones. 63 BC, the Roman general Pompey conquers Jerusalem. He's invited there to resolve a conflict between two brothers and Antipater, the father of Herod Antipas. And so Pompey conquers Jerusalem, establishes Hyrcanus II, but the Romans never leave after their conquest, which is why when Jesus is born, you see in Luke chapter 1, the Romans are doing this census so they can establish how much taxes are owed to them, because they took this area in 63 BC and they never gave it back. After 63 BC, the independent Hasmonean kingdom disappears, and Judah eventually becomes part of the Roman province of Syria. Remember Luke 2, as we read a while ago, Quirinius was the governor of what province? Syria. Syria. It's right there in your Bibles in Luke chapter 2. All right, next week we're going to look at, anybody ever read The Last of the Mohicans or seen the movie The Last of the Mohicans? Next week, if we get through tonight, we're going to look at The Last of the Hasmoneans. That'll be next week. So let's go into the lesson itself then. That's kind of a preview of where we are, and I hope that this chart will help you as you think about biblical history. Yes, sir.
Did that period of time when Alexander the Great was Hellenizing or attempting to bring about this Hellenistic belief, is that where the Septuagint derived from in that effort? Or?
The Septuagint does derive as part of the Hellenization, because you have the Jews who are Greek in background, who speak Greek language. Greek has become the universal language of the world, and so they translate the Bible into Greek, which is what the Septuagint is. Very good question. Yeah, it's part of the Hellenization that the Greeks bring about. So again, the reason you have the Septuagint, it's an excellent point, is because of Alexander the Great and the history that happens in the intertestamental period. So when you look at your New Testament, some of the times they're quoting the Masoretic text. A lot of the times they're quoting the Septuagint. And your commentaries, of course, will tell you that. BCE is a new way of saying that I don't usually use it, but it's It does. That's the purpose of it. And AD is the same thing. It's not AD anymore. It's AE, I think. But yeah, that's another good point. Any other comments? All right. There's two great sources for learning about this period. One is the Antiquities of the Jews by Flavius Josephus. I have a quote from him, and I'll use him a lot in the lesson. The other one is found in the Apocrypha. It's the 1st, 2nd, 3rd, and 4th books of the Maccabees, especially 1st and 2nd Maccabees. Now, we don't consider the apocryphal books as being inspired on the level that the Old Testament is. However, just because they're not inspired doesn't mean they're not helpful, because they're very helpful, especially in giving us the history of this period. And again, pointing to this, and sometimes in the New Testament they do quote from books of the Apocrypha. Here's an interesting, this just kind of goes with next week's lesson, but it kind of sets the stage. He says, King Antiochus, returning from Egypt for fear of the Romans, made an expedition against Jerusalem. Well, actually, this is the beginning. This is in the middle of the night's lesson. I was thinking something else I read. When he was there, in the 143rd year of the king of the Seleucids, which is equivalent to 167, it was the first part of 167, he took the city without fighting. Here's the deal. This happened several times, but it was changed, and there's going to be another mistake in the lesson. It's on me. It's not Judah Maccabee, it's Judas. That's on me. I just got in my head Judah. I said, who would name their kid Judas? And it is Judas. Okay, so it's Judas Maccabee. Judas Maccabee and his brothers changed this rule that got them into so much trouble. And that is, every Sabbath, what are these good Jews doing? Resting. Nothing. So if you're an enemy, when would be a good time to attack them? On the Sabbath. And they did several times. In fact, 3 that we know of, and in each case, Jerusalem is conquered, and the inhabitants are slaughtered. So those of his own party were opening the gates for him, and when he had gotten possession of Jerusalem, he slew many of the opposite party, and when he had plundered it of a great deal of money, he returned to Antioch. Flavius Josephus. Josephus, if you want to look specifically at these events in the Antiquities of the Jews, it's in books 12 and 13. 14 and 15 go a little bit further, but it starts in book 12. I think I have that in the lesson somewhere. You can go online and read these. Again, book 12 and book 13 are from the period between the death of Alexander the Great and Salome, the queen of Israel. Books 14 and 15 cover the period from her death, Salome, through the death of Antigonus, who was the last of the Hasmonean kings. Okay, here's what I was thinking a minute ago. At the end of this book are these words, but these men, the Hasmoneans, lost their government by their dissensions one with another. And it came to Herod, the son of Antipater, who was of no more than a vulgar family, and of no eminent extraction, but one that was subject to other kings. And this is what history tells us was the end of the Asmonean family. Hasmonean is the same thing. And we're going to see that. How that the dissensions among the Jews, and not just in the families, but between those Jews who wanted to be Hellenized, those Jews who did not, their internecine struggles cause them to be weakened. Much like if you look at the Protestant Reformation. The Protestant Reformation could have been stronger. Now again, I understand the sovereignty of God. I understand these things were not to be, but it could have been much stronger if Martin Luther and Ulrich Zwingli could have made up over the subject of Christ's presence at the Lord's Supper. That one issue caused the Protestant Reformation to divide. And at other times it continued to divide, and so it was weakened in that sense. But again, I understand the sovereignty of God in all of this. Again, another helpful book here is the book of Maccabees, which I just read from. All right, so let's start here with the conflicts between the Ptolemies and the Seleucids. In the aftermath of Alexander's death, his kingdom was split between his generals. There were four of them: Cassander, Antigonus, Salome, and Seleucus. Salome and Seleucus vied for power in the Middle East and in North Africa. Finally, under Antiochus, the Seleucids gained control of Syria and Palestine, including Jerusalem. They would remain in power for 35 years. At first, it was peaceful. But then they began to interfere in the religious practices of the Jewish people. And the book of 2 Maccabees tells us how that Seleucus IV sent a man by the name of Heliodorus to plunder the temple. The temple had been looted. We talked about this last week. The temple had been looted 17 times since Sennacherib, the Assyrian general. So if you wanted to store your valuables, the temple was not a good place to do that. It just wasn't. You needed to put them somewhere else. 17 times. 2 Maccabees 3:25 through 30 tells us that how that Heliodorus was struck by a magnificent horse that appears from nowhere. And he was not killed, but he was hurt, and later on he died from his injuries. And the horse and the rider disappeared. The problem, again, the Seleucids are interfering, but the Jews can't really strike back because they're constantly hurting each other. For example, during the reign of Antiochus IV Epiphanes, which is probably the one that is prophesied about in Daniel's prophecy, who brings about the great desecration of the temple, and he did a great desecration of the temple by offering swine on the altar. The high priest Onias III was subverted by his brother Jason, who bribed Antiochus for the appointment to be high priest. Everybody wants to be high priest. 3 years later, when Jason had to raise the bribe for the money, he sent it to Antiochus by another man whose name was Menelaus. Menelaus offered Antiochus his own bribe and was forced to steal silver vessels from the temple to pay off. Again, the temple's being ransacked. This scandal caused an uproar in 172 BC that cost Menelaus' his brother, who was fighting for him, his life. In 1 Maccabees chapter 1, verses 20 through 24, the story of Jason's revolt and the subsequent sack of Jerusalem is depicted. The rest of the Seleucid reign from there on out was one of terror and coercion, which leads to the Maccabean revolt. So here's one for you, Ed. You say you want a revolution? Beatles. I was thinking of that. I actually thought of you when I wrote the subtitle. So the next portion is, you say you want a revolution. Well, they wanted a revolution. But here's the deal. The revolution didn't start as a revolution for freedom. It started as a revolution for freedom of religion. They just wanted to be able to worship without being interfered with. So I want us to read, I'm going to read this, but you can follow along. 1 Maccabees chapter 3, verses 1 through 9. Then his son, Judas, called Maccabeus, rose up in his stead, that is, in the stead of Mattathias. And all his brethren helped him, and all that they that had joined themselves to his father, and they fought with cheerfulness the battle of Israel. And he got his people great honor, and put on a breastplate as a giant, and girded his warlike armor about him in battles, and protected the camp with his sword. In his acts he was like a lion, and like a lion's whelp, roaring for his prey. And he pursued the wicked, and sought them out, and them that troubled his people he burnt with fire. And his enemies were driven away for fear of him, and all the workers of iniquity were troubled, and salvation prospered in his hand. Many people thought he was the Savior. And he grieved many kings, and made Jacob glad with his works, and His memory is blessed forever. And he went through the cities of Judah and destroyed the wicked out of them and turned away the wrath from Israel. And he's renowned even to the utmost part of the earth, and he gathered them that were perishing. Sounds messianic, doesn't it? This is Judas Maccabee. So in 167, his father, Mattathias, killed a Seleucid army commander who was ordering them to sacrifice pagan sacrifices. And this was the beginning, this was the event that sparked the revolution known as the Maccabean Revolution. Mattathias had 5 sons. They called themselves the Hasidim, the pure ones. All 5 of these sons would be known as the Hasmoneans, and all 5 of them would contribute to the war, and all 5 of them would die. I thought, well, how would I tell the history of this in kind of short order? And I decided just to go through these sons and their heirs for the next 100 years of the history of the Jewish people. So I'm going to begin with Judah. He was called, and it's Judas, by the way. Judas was called the Hammer, Judas Maccabee. After Mattathias died in 166, Judas takes over. He fights several campaigns, and eventually he retakes Jerusalem in 164 BC. Especially he controlled the precincts where the temple was located. Now, in one of their conquests, Antiochus III, when he conquered Jerusalem, he built on the high part there what was called the Acra. It was a fortress. And his army was encamped there, and Judas could never conquer. He could never throw those soldiers out of the Acra. So he has most of Jerusalem. The temple was retaken, and the temple was cleansed. After it was cleansed, 3 years to the day when it had been desecrated by Antiochus, the Jewish holiday of Hanukkah was instituted. It's called the Feast of Lights. Again, they could not complete the conquest of the city because of the fortress, Acra, but it would later become the headquarters of the revolt. So 2 Maccabees chapter 5, verses 25 through 26, who when he was come to Jerusalem, pretending peace, this is one of the people that come after Judah has retaken it. Then the Jews keeping the holiday, he commanded his men to take arms and to slew all of them. He slew all of them that were come forth to see, and running through the city with armed men, he destroyed a very great multitude. So I give you that snippet to tell you that the battle goes back and forth for the next 4 years. Here's what happened again. They start the battle for religious freedom, and many of the religious leaders and their supporters join the revolution. But when Jerusalem is retaken and the temple cleansed, many of them drop out of the war. So Judas and his brothers take to mostly guerrilla warfare. But in 160, at the Battle of Elasa, Judah is killed by the Seleucids in a large pitched battle in which they were just crushed. They were not fit for pitched battles. Now, Judas is given much credit for the revolution's success, and you see that in the passage we read a moment ago, because he did recapture the temple, because they did institute Hanukkah, and he's remembered for that. But when he dies, Israel is not an independent state. 2 Maccabees 10, 1 through 8 tells the story of how he took the city, how he cleansed the temple and cleaned out the altars the heathen had set up inside the temple, and how that then they had the great celebration. And again, it's one of those celebrations where the Jews are bringing palm leaves and laying them down during the celebration. All right, any thoughts or questions about Judas Maccabee? Have y'all read him, or you've heard of him, I'm sure, Judas Maccabee. All right. less well known are his brothers. But his brothers, and again, they're building on Judah's success, but his brothers moved the revolution along much further than maybe even Judas could ever have imagined. Jonathan is the next brother that takes control as the central leader in the revolution, and he's going to be the head of the revolution from 160 through 143 BC. You'll notice, Dan, I do not use BCE in my allusions. He made great gains for the cause of independence. He not only did this through battles and through the guerrilla warfare that they were using, but the Seleucids were also having their own problems. There were different people vying for to be king and leader of the Seleucid Empire, and Jonathan learned how to play these guys off of each other. He would offer bribes, and his nephew Hyrcanus would be very good at this as well. But because he did that, he strengthened his power in Jerusalem. Again, paying bribes and buying off the generals and buying off the kings, and they're kind of not watching what he's doing. And so he's building his power to the point that he lays siege to the fortress Acra in 145. He could not breach the walls, but because he had so much success and they had so many casualties, the Seleucids offered him concessions if he would halt his attack. Israel was granted more freedoms. Their tribute was reduced greatly. But in his playing one against the other, he was allied with, I think it was Seleucus III or one of those guys, and he was against Trypho, one of the generals, and then he swapped sides. This is Jonathan, swapped sides to Trypho, and in their alliance, they defeated the other general, and Jonathan, in Trypho's eyes, became his puppet king. But he wanted complete power, and so he invited Jonathan and his men to a great banquet in their honor. And when they came into the city, they shut the gates, they slaughtered his men, imprisoned Jonathan, and ultimately Jonathan was put to death by Trypho in 143 BC. So now it's the next brother up. And the next brother is Simon, who is the last of the surviving sons of Mattathias. He renews the campaign of Jonathan, his brother. Trypho is disciplined by the Seleucids. First Maccabees chapter 13, verses 49 through 52 describe this. But they were all in the castle of Jerusalem. This is Simon and his men who were hindered from coming out and going to the country, from buying and selling. And they cried to Simon, verse 50, for peace, and he granted it to them, and he cast them out from thence. This is the Seleucids. He cleansed the castle from uncleanness, and they entered into the 23rd day of the second month of year 171, with thanksgiving and branches. This is in 140. Of palm trees and harps, again the palm trees, and cymbals and psalteries and hymns and canticles, because the great enemy was destroyed out of Israel, and he ordained that these days should be kept every year with gladness. And this great fortress known as the Acra was destroyed. It was demolished so thoroughly that we only know it from written history. Archaeologists have never found a trace of the Acra. It was demolished so thoroughly. Simon is considered to be the first true Hasmonean monarch. He successfully rebuilds the city of Jerusalem, regained most of the lands of Judah and even beyond into southern Syria, and his success, as you see here in the lesson, was short-lived because he is assassinated in 135 at a banquet in Jericho by a son-in-law, Salome, not kin to the Ptolemies of Egypt. Salome also murdered the king's wife and two of his sons. However, the king had 3 sons, and John Hyrcanus was not at the banquet, which proved to be very unfortunate for Ptolemy. Because John Hyrcanus, who is the next, he's the grandson now, he's the son of Simon, so the grandson of Mattathias, put down the rebellion of Ptolemy and became the next Hasmonean king. Under his rule, the struggle for religious freedom became the struggle for a free and independent state. And he is known as the one who begins the movement that we know today as Zionism. Remember that I quoted Theodora Herbert last week in the lesson, and he was, in 1894, he writes, Will the Jewish People Return? I can't remember the entire title of the book, but again, it was a proclamation of Zionism. Well, what is Zionism? Zionism is essentially an international movement among Jewish people, some Jewish people. Not all Jewish people are Zionists. There are many people in this country, and you wonder, well, why don't they support certain politicians or certain people who are pro-Israel? It's because they're not pro-Israel. They're Jews as far as heritage goes and that kind of thing, but as far as heart for their homeland or really a heart for their religion, they're practical atheists. Judaism for them is a culture, not a religion, even when they go to the synagogues. So it's not that every Jew is a Zionist, but all Zionists would be Jews, and it is those Jews in the nations who want to see an independent state of Israel established, whether they go back or whether they do not. They want to see the independent state established, and that for that state to be free. Now, of course, that's not a popular idea in the world. But that whole idea, again, I'm talking about this important period of history. This idea begins with the Maccabees, with the Hasmonean monarchy. This monarchy that we never hear about. This is not the line of David. This is not the line of Zadok. It's not the line of Levi as far as the priests go. It's separate from all of that, and yet when we think about modern Israel, the real roots of modern Israel go back to that period of time and to the events that we're looking at tonight. Shortly after he became king, John was attacked by Antiochus VII. And remember, Antiochus IV is the real bad guy. The north wall of Jerusalem was always its weak spot because it was on level ground. It wasn't overlooking a bluff. Antiochus was about to breach the walls when John Hyrcanus offered him a bribe, which he accepted. But this time, the temple treasury was not up to the task of paying off the king, and so they had to rob the silver from the tomb of David to pay Antiochus VII. Afterwards, John was not threatened by the Seleucids anymore during his reign, and he actually expanded the kingdom even more, especially to the south. He conquered the land of the Idumeans, and he mandated that all of the Idumeans adopt Judaism. How important is that for history? How important is that for the time of Jesus? It's colossal. Colossal. Why does Herod build or rebuild the second temple? Why is Herod concerned about the Jews? Because Herod is part of the Idumeans who have been converted to Judaism, even though they're considered to be second-class Jews, if that. It was a time of prosperity for Jerusalem. And during their prosperity and religious freedom, something happened that the Seleucids, though they tried and tried for years to force Hellenization upon the people of Israel, and especially Jerusalem, they could not do it. But what they could not do by force, prosperity did by compromise. The city expanded to the west, and in their new wealth, they became more and more Hellenized. They built city squares. They built gymnasiums. All of these things they did that they had refused to do for centuries, or for a century, over a century, and now, here's the word, they accommodate. Because it fits their new lifestyle. Hyrcanus dies in 104 BC. His son, Alexander Jannaeus, will become king. The wife of his son, Salome, will be the queen before the last king. He rules from 103 to 76 BC as both king and high priest. Now, how do you think that plays to the purists? Not too good. They hated it. So again, you have now this struggle between the Jews themselves. Two parties have emerged. We see both of them in the New Testament. We talked about this in intertestamental literature. We even talked about it in our series when we were introducing Paul. The two sects were the Pharisees and the Sadducees. The Pharisees were the pure ones. They believed in the law, not just the Pentateuch, but the law and the prophets. The Sadducees were more into just the Pentateuch. The Sadducees didn't believe in life after death. The Sadducees were about Moses. So were the Pharisees, but even more the prophets. The Pharisees knew that because of idolatry, Israel had been overthrown and sent into exile. So the Pharisees are against this, and they revolt against Jannaeus. Jannaeus is a Sadducee. On one occasion, and this is in Josephus' account, he goes to the temple to offer sacrifices. And the people in the crowds, the mob, shout at him. They're shouting insults, and they're throwing citrons at him. Little melon. These aren't the kind of citrons we grow, like the watermelon-looking things, but there's a tree, and it has a little fruit, and they were throwing these at him. And he was so enraged that he denied access to the temple for the Pharisees. And eventually he would execute 6,000 Jews of the Pharisees' party. This led to a civil war, and the Pharisees couldn't win. So they surrendered in 88 BC, only to have 800 of those who surrendered, again, because of the indignation of Jannaeus. And again, Josephus is reporting this. 800 of these Pharisee rebels were brought into Jerusalem and crucified before a great banquet that Jannaeus is having. Reminds you of another historical figure by the name of Nero. See, Jannaeus had some Greek ways in him too, didn't he? He crucified 800 of them, and before they died, there's a period you're hanging on the cross and it takes a little time for you to die. He slaughtered their families in front of their eyes. Just like Nebuchadnezzar had done to Zedekiah. Jannaeus is a Sadducee. Okay? Josephus says this. He says the revenge of Junius was inhuman. Inhuman. Now remember, one thing you need to remember when you read Josephus, who is Josephus' primary audience? An audience that he's not 100% pro that side, but he wants to stay on their good side, and that is the Romans. He's captured before the siege of Jerusalem. He reports the whole thing. Then he writes the Antiquities and the Jewish Wars. But he writes as in Roman, he wasn't a prisoner, but he was in their custody, you will say. And so he doesn't want to antagonize the Romans. Junius died in 76 BC, and his widow Salome became the queen of the Hasmonean kingdom. She ruled from 76 through 67. She's one of two queens Israel ever had. And we're not talking about modern-day prime ministers. I know they've had at least one woman, Golda Meir. But there was one other queen who ruled for a short period of time. You remember her? Her name was Athaliah. And she was a despicable woman, killed by the high priest. After her death, her sons, Hyrcanus II and Aristobulus II, that should be the third, fought over the throne. Aristobulus wins, Hyrcanus is forced into exile, and Aristobulus, like his father, ruled as both king and high priest. Again, he's not a very popular guy. Meanwhile, back in Idumea, there's a family that is rising from obscurity to power. Antipater, however you want to say his name, his father had received an appointment to the governorship over Idumea by the Seleucids. He's looking for a path to power over the entire region. So he arranges an alliance between himself and Hyrcanus. He says to Hyrcanus, you know, you gave up too easily. You let your brother run you out of town too easily. You should be king. And then the two of them join King Aretas of the Nabateans. And this triumvirate marches against Aristobulus and Jerusalem. So Jerusalem is under siege once again. Then an interesting thing happens. Both Aristobulus and Hyrcanus II send word to Pompey that they need him to mediate this problem and decide who should be the king. First, Pompey sides with Aristobulus, but eventually he sides with Hyrcanus II. So they go in, and once again, Jerusalem is under siege, and in 63 BC, the walls were breached after 3 months of fighting, and Aristobulus III and his men are slaughtered. Brothers didn't mean a whole lot sometimes then, did they? Didn't mean much to Herod either. Afterwards, to the surprise of many of the Jews, Pompey entered the temple and offered his own sacrifices, spices, all kinds of things. They were horrified. But afterwards, he restored Hyrcanus to the office of high priest, and the temple was once again cleansed, and they went back to the Jewish way of sacrificing. And so I'm going to leave you tonight with this. Pompey has entered Jerusalem. He's taken that area. He's not going to give it up. He's going to be there. When Jesus is born, he's there. When the apostles write the New Testament, he's there. Not him, but his successors. So the Romans are going to control that area in Jerusalem for the next several hundred years, thanks to this brotherly struggle between Hyrcanus II and Aristobulus III, and also with the influence of the father of Herod the Great. So just to preview next week a little bit, we're going to look at how Herod the Great, he had to dodge, he had to walk through some minefields to survive, but he did. Pompey is he is part of the first triumvirate with Julius Caesar, but then the second triumvirate after the murder of Julius Caesar on the Ides of March, the second triumvirate emerges, and the second, it's like what is it, the three tenors? You can always remember two of them. Right now all I can remember is Pavarotti, but I know in the triumvirate there's Antony, Augustus, and I think it's Cassius. Or was he in the first? Can't remember. But anyway, there's the second triumvirate. But the second triumvirate collapses, and Antony, who Herod gets to be buddies with, we'll see this next week, Antony doesn't win. So, we'll see. And there's a lot of intrigue, and we'll see the last of the Hasmonean kings as well. All right, any questions or comments before we leave? I hope you found this helpful. I mean, this is a very important period of history. It's very important to the development of the New Testament, to who Jesus was and the time in which he lived. Don't you find it fascinating that Jesus comes into the world on the cusp of all of this? I mean, he didn't come when the second temple is dedicated. He didn't come when Malachi was finished with his book. No, he came 400 years later, after the world goes through this great upheaval. And Israel especially goes through a tremendous time and times of upheaval and bloodshed and all the rest to get to Luke chapter 2, Matthew chapter 1, Matthew chapter 2.